welcome to Premiere Pro color grading. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put an adjustment layer on top of our footage and go up to the Lumetri color panel. We're going to start with basic corrections. Now you can do all of this in just the basic corrections, but we're going to start with a LUT, and that is going to be the Canon C-Log LUT. And it's a pretty good start, but obviously we need to make some further adjustments. So I'm going to start by, maybe adding a little bit of warmth to it and increasing the saturation. I'm going to increase the contrast a little bit, maybe add some highlights, maybe pull the shadows down a little bit. And in fact, I'll bring the blacks down a little bit too so that the background is a little bit darker. Okay. So far, so good. Now I'm going to move into the creative panel, and I'm just going to add a little bit of sharpening and add a little bit of vibrance, so those greens are a little bit more punchy. Okay, moving along, I'm going to go down to the curves panel. Now, the curves panel can be very overwhelming, so I'm going to start with just a simple S-curve, and we'll come back to the other panels a little bit later. So, simple S-curve, I'm going to drag the lower left section down, which brings the shadows down, and I'm going to drag the top right section up, which increases the brightness in the top area. And again, just adds a little bit more contrast. All right, the color wheels and match. So I don't typically use the color wheels too much because it's not very fine-tuned adjustments, but you can raise the mids a little bit, bring the shadows down a little bit. This just helps with some additional contrast. Bring the highlights up a little, and maybe I want to add a little bit of warmth to the highlights. I can do that by clicking this point and dragging it up and a little bit to the left. Again, it's a little too broad. It's not fine-tuned adjustments, so I don't do a whole lot in the color wheels panel. HSL secondary, hue, saturation, luma secondary. This can get confusing, so we're going to move on and come back to it. Vignette. Obviously, if you drag the vignette slider to the left, it gets dark, and if you drag it to the right, it gets light. So, you want to be subtle with this. Drag it down to the left a little bit. These three sliders underneath will help decide how round and how much fall off there is on your vignette. Again, subtlety is key. All right, back up to the hue, saturation, luma secondary adjustment. Again, this can be kind of confusing, kind of overwhelming, but let's say there is a specific color that you want to make adjustments to. You can do that by grabbing this color picker here and selecting a point in your frame. So I went with his face because I want to, maybe make it pop a little bit more. If you click this button here, you'll see a gray overlay, and then you kind of have to drag these sliders around to make sure that you're seeing what is being masked. Right now, I'm not seeing anything. Obviously, if I drag this down a little bit, then you can see, oh, okay, now the oranges that I wanted to select are being actually selected. Drag these around a little bit. You can get really fine-tuned with this, but if your frame is really busy, then it gets harder to be more fine-tuned. You can do this a lot easier in DaVinci. All right, don't want all of that green. I really just want some of his skin tones, so I'm going to try to make some more fine-tuned adjustments here. I'll get as close as I can for this example. All right, that's probably good enough. And I'll feather this out a little bit. Then when you come down here to the denoise and blur, you want to turn this up a little bit because then it will it'll soften, it'll feather your edges a little bit so they're not so rough. And if you scroll down, then you can make your adjustments. You can add more warmth. You can add a little bit of magenta, maybe. You can add some saturation, contrast, sharpening. You can do all that stuff. And then in the color wheel above, you can actually change exposure if you need to. Then when you turn this mask off, you can see that it's made some difference. If you toggle this on and off, you can see how much of a difference it made. All right, now I want to add a creative LUT. So I'm going to go to the creative panel. I'm going to go to look, and I'm going to go custom. I'm going to find, this is just a LUT that I happen to really like. So I'm going to add that here. Now I'm adding it in the creative panel because, whoa, that's too much, but you can adjust the intensity. And so you just kind of dial this in to preference. Again, this is just a LUT that I happen to like. I like what it does to the shadows. I like what it does to the oranges. So I like this look, so I'm going to stick with it. Now I want to show you what you can do in the curves panel with some of these more scary looking adjustment layers. So here we have hue versus saturation. So what that means is any point that you pick on this color line, you can adjust the saturation of that point. So I want to adjust the greens. I want to make them a little bit more saturated. So I'm going to find a point on this line where I think that color lives, and that's kind of in this greeny, yellowy bit. If you create two outer points, that's as far over as your adjustment will go. Then you create a center point and you can drag that up for more saturation and drag it down for less saturation. Then moving on to hue versus hue, this is exactly like the one above, except instead of changing the saturation, it's changing the actual color. So I'm going to try to change the grass to a little bit more of a greeny color. So I'm going to select that same color area, and again, if you click and drag one way, it'll change the hue in one direction. If you drag the other way, it'll change it in a different direction. Now, hue versus luma is the same thing. You select that point on the color line, and this actually just changes the brightness. So if I just want the greens to be a little bit brighter, I can do that. If I want, his skin to be brighter, I can select that color. In fact, I'm going to go back and I'm going to make some adjustments to his shirt as well. So I'm going to find, some sort of bluish, greenish color on his shirt, and it's sort of in this range. So I'm going to click and drag these points, and I'm going to decide, okay, do I want his shirt to be more green or do I want it to be more blue? Maybe since there's already so much green in this shot, I'm going to drag it down to be a little bit more blue. And then back down in hue versus luma, same thing, I'm going to drag similar points, but maybe I want it to be a little bit brighter. Now, the further out your outside points are, the more gradual of a shift it will be. So you want your points to be a little bit further out without affecting too many other colors. And again, it's just so that you've got a little bit more of a gradual gradient. And I decided I don't want these blues to be any brighter, so I'm going to get rid of those points. All right, luma versus saturation. If you want to adjust the saturation in the bright and dark values of your image, you can do that here. So like here, I lowered the saturation in the shadows, and then here I'm lowering the saturation in the highlights. And you can kind of see on his skin, because that is the highest level of luma in the scene. Saturation versus saturation is a little bit more complicated to explain, but it just affects the most and least saturated elements in your scene. Everything is relatively similarly saturated here, so I can't really make many adjustments, but there are definitely ways that you can use this tool in other footage. All right, so now I want to show you a little bit about masking. So I want his face to be a little bit brighter. So I'm going to add another adjustment layer. And then on that adjustment layer, I'm going to go up into the effects controls, and I'm going to add a circular mask. And that mask is just going to go over his face. Now you can draw a mask if it's a really complicated shape. You can make a square, rectangle mask. Circle works fine for his face. So I'm just going to resize this a little bit. And then I'm going to be sure to feather the edges a lot because, again, I want this to be a gradual change. So you can see here, the dotted line represents a feathered edge. All right, now I'm going to go into Lumetri, and I'm just going to increase the exposure a little bit, and you can see that it's making his face brighter. You can also see if I had a hard edge, it would be really obvious. So again, feathered edge is better. Now, with this mask, I want to track it as he runs. Premiere has a pretty good tracking feature, so the first thing you want to do is click the stopwatch here, and you can see it's created a little keyframe, and then you click the play button and it will track forward. Now this takes 100 years.
One eternity later.
All right, moving on to exporting. So Premiere has this really weird glitch where your exports don't have the same amount of contrast and saturation as what you're seeing while you're editing. So there is a fix for this. If you go to File, Preferences, and General, and make sure that you are clicking the Display Color Management checkbox here. Now, I don't know what this does, but you want to have it done. First thing you're going to notice is that your image gets a little bit darker. So go ahead, make whatever adjustments that you need to do. I'm going to just, kind of raise the shadows up a little bit, raise the blacks up a little bit, get it back to where it was. Yep, that's looking good. And now when you go to export, save it wherever you want to save it. Then go down to Effects and click the Lumetri Look LUT and select this guy right here, the QT Gamma Compensation LUT. This is provided by Adobe because they know this is a problem. So once you apply that and click export, then when you open your file and compare it to what you've been editing, your colors should match completely. So there you go. So there's just a little bit about how I color grade in Premiere. You can do all of this in DaVinci. Some of the names might be different. Obviously, the tools are going to be in different places, but I just wanted to share that there are so many tools that you can use built into the program. And I know that sometimes they might look overwhelming, but just play around with it and see what can I do here. So hopefully this was helpful. Thanks for watching.